Hello, listeners, from Roy Demarev in Sam, and welcome to the last and fifth of a series of recordings about the greening of the Russian city of Ekaterinburg. This week I'm going to focus on some of the approaches which have made the project successful to date and about which we can learn for applicability in our own Western cities. I shall cover the technical or the scientific aspects that they called into use, and then also talk about the way the whole project is being financed and managed by the City Council of Ekaterinburg. Even before I get on to that, I think it's worth stressing that environmentalism has a whole energy and purpose behind it in the Green City movement, and I might have mentioned in earlier broadcasts that there are now green building councils in 70-odd countries. Admittedly, green building is not the whole story, but it certainly fits in with the greening of an entire city. If I now turn to the scientific issues at stake, I should begin by saying, in any case, most aspects of a city are like circulatory systems, be that the people and the vehicles moving in and out, or whether it's electrical power, or indeed fresh and wastewater, and the pipes throughout the city. So in any case, people think in terms of circulation and sustainability through that circulation. Now, the various disciplines or research methodologies brought together, well, they're quite several, but I'll mention three, not least because the wording is not obvious. For example, they used the method of what's called today landscape ecology. Now, that is the science of studying and improving relations between the various ecological processes in the environment and the particular ecosystems, including the landscape. The next fancy topic is something called dendroecology. Now, I didn't know what that meant. I don't know if you did. But it means that they study the growth of woody plants, all this business about looking at the rings inside the trunk of a tree, to study the variability of the annual increment of wood and to identify the factors which determine the variability and the dating of events that affect the growth of woody plants. And finally, that lets them deduce what former environmental conditions applied. Looks like they're changing going forward anyway. And the third topic is more understandable perhaps. They take a systems approach that covers the entire project, a development and preservation of the city's recreational system, of its green spaces all linked together as an entity. A systems approach seeks explicitly to take these separate components, parks, woodlands, streets, and even roofs, and then looks into their interaction. Now, it's not possible just to have academic or theoretical input for a project like this. Things have to be tested in the practice. Now, as it happens, they've got woods all over the place in Russia, so they were able to put aside wood or woodlands to see what really worked. So they used pilot or test plantings of trees, for example, to tell the researchers what they needed to know. For example, they needed to know which tree species best resist dust and which trees give the most powerful what are called phytoncides. I have mentioned that earlier. That's the moisture from trees, which has the nice result of killing bacteria. And then there's the issue of which species are likely to adjust to the climate several decades hence. Bit tricky because you can't really apply this future climate in a test being conducted today, but they nevertheless included that in their objectives. There's the issue of how much maintenance each tree species actually requires and how fast they grow. Now let me turn to how the project was set up and managed. It obviously came from the City Council of the city of Ekaterinburg, but to understand how things work in Russia, you have to realize that the forests are owned by the federal government, but they sort of hand them over to the regional governments to look after and develop, for example, forest plans. That's another topic we're working on, together with the university in Ekaterinburg devoted to forest engineering. Yet you will have noticed that we always talk about the greening of the city of Ekaterinburg rather than of the region of Sverdlovsk, where Ekaterinburg is the capital. And that's because the whole delegation of authority comes from Moscow through Sverdlovsk to Ekaterinburg. And it's in Ekaterinburg that they make the decisions, but they get money from the higher instances. The project does not represent fast action. In fact, they first started talking about it back in 2004 and only really got started on it in 2013. So we've been up and running now for less than 5 years. And they can go as far with their project as 2020, although they do go beyond that, probably to 2025, but with only general objectives. Now, they've set up a committee under the chairmanship of a certain Tamara Blagodatkova, who is now the driving force behind the project. And what she's done is set up a number of task forces for the implementation, reporting to the committee. And the task forces, it's too boring for me to list them all out to you, but they involve just about everybody in Ekaterinburg, representatives of the population, through business, schools, the Federal Forestry Agency, of course, and various specialists in nature management, plus academics and researchers from universities, notably the Ural State Forest Engineering University, and I guess I have to confess that I am an honorary professor there. The Green City Project has a website of its own, and it's very open. Of course, you have to be able to read Russian to make much sense of it. It has photographs of every committee member, their contact details and their responsibilities. And that is really a great example of transparency, actually in Russian life, which is not actually universal. Of the budget, which in dollar terms is something like 140 million, most of it does come from the city budget itself, from the taxation they raise locally. That's about 92% of it. And the rest comes from federal grant flowing through, as I tried to explain, the Sverdlovsk region. It is of note to me that the population of Ekaterinburg started off with quite a lot of skepticism about this project. Was it going to be a waste of money? Was it going to actually achieve its ends and so on? But this sort of perturbed interest in the project has now died away for a very simple reason. They set yearly targets, they publish them, and they tell them they've been reached. And when you start seeing the evidence of new plantings and better maintained woodlands, and maybe some nice new furniture in the streets, you start saying, this is not a bad project after all, I'll lend it my support. And there's another step, a step beyond sort of relying just on the local government to do things, but they actually participate at a private level as well. So we're talking about roofs with nice plantings on them, well-maintained gardens, nice flower boxes on the balconies. They have lots of balconies in Russia. And all this, and this is partly a reflection of my own, would indicate how there's a gradual change in Russia from let's just leave everything to the authorities to do it ourselves. You know, when you go into a housing or flats in Russia, the inside is always beautiful, but the outside is always a mess. It's because there's no sense of let's work together and maintain the building and its beauty. However, that is changing because of this Green City project in Ekaterinburg, and I think that is a very important change in attitude of the population in Russia. They have a long way to go, but they will eventually become much more socially interactive and responsible than they are today, these 25 years or so beyond the end of the Soviet Union. One of the best illustrations of how the citizens of Ekaterinburg are so involved now is that they run a city floral decoration competition, and no less than 250 organizations are involved in this competition. It's really great, and then you can have prizes and awards, they love awards, for the best landscape district. Ekaterinburg was certainly the pioneer in the Green City movement, which is gradually taking off in Russia. The other cities that have followed the example of Ekaterinburg include Volgograd, that's the former Stalingrad, in case you don't know, a big city in Siberia called Omsk. And then you'll find all sorts of cities are interested. They're not quite there yet, but those with more than 1 million population are moving that way. We've got Nizhny Novgorod, Kazan, we've got Tver, Zavan, Suzdal, Klinsky, Sochi, which was, of course, famous for its Olympic Games. And yet, in all this, Ekaterinburg was the pioneer. So what, in summary, are the 5 basic requirements which will end up making Ekaterinburg beautiful, sustainable, and healthy to live in? Well, we've identified from this research 5 dimensions, and I'll just list them before I stop talking to you today. The first is a serious commitment by the city authorities to finance and implement the project. Number 2 is that there has to be a national framework in which the city plan can be fitted. Number 3 is that you need a multidisciplinary technical team to propose the detail of the project, and typically calling upon a university specializing in forest engineering. 4, you need the participation of the citizens as a whole. That's both in terms of their comments and their enthusiasm, their work, and that work will often be on a voluntary basis. And number 5 would be that these various entities involved need to collaborate closely, and that implies regular meetings led, as I think we have in the case of Ekaterinburg, by a person and a personality which is going to really push things forward. Well, that's the end of our series on the greening of Ekaterinburg, and maybe next week I'll be going back to more financial matters. Speak to you then.